weeds that we tend to see a lot. There are so many weeds, we could spend quite a long time reviewing the weeds, but we're going to try and give you some tools today to help you ID some on your own too. So Rebecca's going to do that after me. And so why is it important to identify the weed before you go to try and control it? Well, knowing what weeds you want to control really helps you understand what options you have available for control. If you can use a post-emergent herbicide or a pre-emergent, and so those would be like, has the plant sprouted yet, or can you actually prevent it from sprouting? And then also it also helps you understand what are going to be some of your most effective treatments for the plant. So some herbicides work better with some plants and not as well with others. So I'm setting a little timer so we can be on time. And it also helps you understand the best timing for when to spray the plant. So when the plants are most susceptible to herbicide and when maybe you need to use a different tool. Okay, so let's get started. I think it's going to go. There we go. Okay, so first off, we have yellow foxtail. And just a quick review of what these slides are going to look like. We have here we have the scientific name. So if you really wanted to look it up exactly what it is, you have your scientific name. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the plant, whether or not it's native or introduced, and if it's an annual or a perennial, and then about how tall it usually grows, just to help you kind of identify it a little bit. And then if there's any other interesting information or helpful information, I'll include that too. So this is yellow foxtail. We're gonna do irrigated pasture plants first, and then we'll go into rangeland weeds. And we are gonna move a little fast because I've got about 15 plants to cover in about 10 minutes. So we're gonna move fast in general tonight just to try to make space for all the information we wanna share, but also to try and answer some of your questions. And we are, like I said, we're recording, so these videos are gonna be posted on YouTube later. And so if you missed anything, you can go back and get them. So that's just a little bit more information. This plant is Smutgrass, another weed in irrigated pasture. And in this case, there's actually a publication available to help you learn more about managing Smutgrass. And they're not available for all things, but we do have a few publications that are very specific to certain species. This plant is barnyard grass. One of the things I read about barnyard grass is that it tends to look different in lots of different places. So you might notice that in this top picture here, we don't really see awns on the barnyard grass, but then we see some down here. So it's just kind of gonna look different wherever you go. So looking at lots of different pictures of barnyard grass, if you think that's what you have, might be helpful. This plant is Johnson grass. It can be toxic under some conditions, typically weather conditions, or sometimes with mowing. So it just varies, and we can certainly provide more information if anyone has any questions about that. Baltic Rush. This is a native plant, but it's found in irrigated pastures. It's a little bit of a weed because the cattle it's not as palatable as some of the other irrigated pasture species. And it's usually found where there's not as good a drainage in your pasture. Bur Buttercup. This plant is fairly small compared to the others, and it can be poisonous, usually when it's green, but it can be poisonous in some circumstances. Takes a pretty high, the animals have to eat a lot for it to really have a negative effect. This plant is curly dock. Again, some of these plants are found in irrigated pastures and they can be poisonous, but it's only under certain circumstances. So it's best to, if you have it and you're concerned, to ask us a few more questions about it and we can be more specific. And also later on, Brooke's going to cover some poisonous plants. And so I don't know all the plants she's going to cover, but she's going to cover some of the most common ones that we find and give you more information. This is Smartweed. And again, this plant typically occurs in areas of an irrigated pasture that have poor drainage. This is, so moving on to rangeland plants. This is Medusahead. One thing about Medusahead is that it tends to stay green longer than some of the other grasses we find on rangeland. So the picture down at the bottom is a really good example of that, where the rest of the grasses have turned green. Or I'm sorry, have turned brown, and the Medusahead is still green. So when you're driving along a road And you see mostly brown grass, but some green, it kind of really sticks out. The mature plants are fairly high in silica, which means two things. One, they're not palatable to livestock. They just don't taste good. They also don't digest very well, but also they tend to hang around on the landscape for quite a while because they just don't break down in under the typical weather conditions that our other annual grasses break down. And there's actually a management guide, Medusahead management guide for the Western states, and it's free. I was able to download it, and it's just over 60 pages, so it's pretty comprehensive. Barb Goatgrass is another one that we kind of think of in relation to Medusahead. They are different, but again, this Barb Goatgrass will be green later in the season, just like Medusahead. It's also not palatable to livestock. And we have a publication, this one's about 5 pages, on some management strategies to control Barb Goatgrass. One interesting thing about Barb Goatgrass is that the seeds, it produces about 6 seeds per spikelet, and especially the bottom seeds will, they're able to sprout twice. So it sets seed, and that first seed will sprout in the first year, but then it kind of hangs around underneath the plant. And then in the second year that top plant dies, especially if it doesn't set seed, then that second seed is able to sprout. And so 2 years of treating Barb Goatgrass effectively is really important to controlling it and to stopping the spread. And it's really best to catch Barb Goatgrass. It's really best to catch all invasive species early, but Barb Goatgrass is one that can be really hard to control once it gets going. Italian thistle. One interesting thing about Italian thistle is that we know it tends to prefer sites with higher nitrogen. So in this picture on the right, we see it under an oak tree. And I actually had some input from a rancher who had an oak tree fall, and then he had Italian thistle there for quite a few years, and he couldn't figure out why he couldn't get rid of the Italian thistle. And finally, about year 20, which is about when all the nitrogen from a fallen oak tree is kind of the same as the rest of the system, the Italian thistle just kind of went away. So if you see Italian thistle, you know there's probably a little bit more nitrogen in the soil there. Mustard. And mustard's fairly common. We see it along a lot of roadsides. It is introduced. It is palatable to livestock for most of its growing, for most of the time that it's growing. If they eat a lot of it, it can cause some intestinal upset, but they do have to eat a lot of it. And there are some weeds that we're going to talk about today that maybe we are aware of them, but we don't really control for them because they serve some other purposes on the landscape. In this case, mustard is a weed, but it also does provide some forage value. So this one is tarweed, and it's also sometimes called curly cup gumweed. It's good for pollinators. It's not palatable to livestock, and it's also known to concentrate selenium within the plant. So it's a good thing that it's not palatable, because livestock could potentially get selenium toxicity if they were to eat a lot of it. And it is native. This one is doveweed, sometimes called turkey mullein, and it is a native. It stays pretty small. When you see it out on the landscape, it's usually 1 foot or less, and the seeds are good food for birds and some other wildlife. So it's a handy. It's a plant that the cattle don't usually like. They don't eat it, but it does provide some purpose on the landscape. All right, so I did move fairly quickly, and let me check the chat and see if there are any questions, and then we can move forward with Rebecca.